Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to do a webinar with Alex Golbin. He's a senior financial services executive with over 2 decades of leading risk management, enterprise resiliency, operations and technology transformation, and leveraging state of the art technology. He's worked in many top banks, including but not limited to Citi, BNY Mellon, S&P, and various others. And most interestingly, recently he published a terrific book called Navigating Supply Chain Cyber Risk, a comprehensive guide to managing third party cyber risk. So, Alex, big thank you for being with us.
Alex, it's a pleasure. Look forward to the conversation. And yeah, good morning, everyone.
Well, let's talk about how you got to where you are. You and I share some similarities. We both came to US from Eastern Europe around the same time as immigrants. We're now both helping organizations navigate their third-party cyber risk. We're protecting the defenders from the bad guys and trying to limit this whole contagion of a supply chain cyber risk. So what are some of the pivotal moments that got you to where you are today?
Yeah, that's right. We did come around the same time, not quite from the same city, but very, very close. And I remember even Alex looking at your recent LinkedIn post talking about how when you came to this country, going through the streets of Brooklyn and looking at furniture and picking it up. And I've done the same thing as a kid. I remember going with my parents doing that. So, really I'm very appreciative for all the opportunities that I was able to get to where I am, and really looking for opportunities to give back to the industry, give back to the community. I grew up as a technologist. It was difficult for me to get disconnected from coding, but in many years that I was at Bank of New York, some of the opportunities was I managed all of our technology vendors. One of the areas where I got excited about is opportunity to help the industry to really do it collectively and really do it more as a shared service. That's where I actually got recruited from Bank of New York to lead industry utility for third-party risk, which is now S&P Global. It was a joint venture with 16 major banks to really think through what is a collective way to come up with an industry standard for questions, for control objectives, for just how to assess your vendors and do it at scale instead of each individual bank doing it themselves. So that's where, when I was there, I met my two co-authors for this book, and AJ Singh and Ariel Evans. They're very talented, deep experts in cyber, previously published award-winning authors. And they told me, hey, would you be interested to do something with us? And we thought that based on our collective expertise, it would be a lot of fun because we would all bring in our different perspectives. And years later, the book came out. It came out in April of this year. It was on Amazon. It was really great to see. It was number one in new releases in risk management, outsourcing, and other categories when that came out. So, really exciting. I think third party risk is such an amazing topic. It's going to be the most dynamic topic that's going to continue to evolve as we approach the future as well.
So the whole topic of, third-party risk is really fascinating because we're all interconnected to each other. So, as you really expanded your role from a traditional executive to also being involved in TPRM and becoming a co-author of this book, what are some lessons you learned that you'd like to share about the whole TPRM and supply chain risk?
That's a great question. And there is no great one answer for how should I do TPRM because it's so cross functional at large banks and at large companies. You really have to think through what is the right structure, where does that belong, and how do you think about convergence of some of the risks. So, how much of that is cyber risk, how much of that is compliance risk, data risk, and all of the other components. So people who run third-party risk need to be deep experts in multiple things. They need to be really cross-functional. They need to understand the content. What I see work best is not have check the box mentality, but to always have a risk-based approach in mind. And then organizational placement is a lot of fun to figure out too. Where should third party risk report to? Does it report to chief procurement officer? Does it report to the CIO? Does it report to CISO? How do the different functions that are distributed, how do they come together? What is the role of the chief risk officer in all of this? So getting the right sponsorship, being clear in the goals. And in the book, we talk a lot about some of the best practices that are real lessons learned, what to avoid, how to navigate organizational politics, and just being open that it's going to continue to evolve. And here is what you need to do to be successful.
So, in your book, you talk about a staggering statistic that vendors are responsible for 63% of reported breaches, almost 70% of data breaches are due to third party negligence, where an attacker gets into the third party and then uses it as a jumping pod to get into the rest of the infrastructure. So, why is it such a high number? What's going on?
Yeah, so I remember when we started, right, trying to develop software, you've got an army of developers that are developing homegrown applications. The world has evolved, technology is moving so fast, so it's not really economical to rely on only your own development efforts. You're using third-party components, your vendor software is embedded in your applications, it's embedded in your infrastructure, it's everywhere. And it's not about your immediate suppliers, it's also about your suppliers of suppliers. It's that end party visibility as well. So if I am a bad actor, why am I going to do hard things? If I'm a bad actor, I'm lazy. I want to find the most efficient way to get into your control environment. So it's really the weakest point. And the weakest point can be abstracted because in many cases it's not as visible, controls are not well understood, inventory of your third parties, fourth parties may have gaps, and navigating between those edges is where bad actors have a strategic advantage. And we always have to continue to catch up with that and stay on top of that.
With the rise of third party suppliers, we really send our information everywhere. You're not going to do your own taxes. You're going to send your taxes to an audit firm. You're going to upload your documents to Dropbox or some type of a file storage mechanism. With all these cyber incidents within your vendor ecosystem, you need to have a risk management program in place. And to that end, as we look at cybersecurity both within the enterprise and the vendor ecosystem, how do you even deal with the proliferation of all these thousands of vendors? And what are some of the best practices that you would recommend around securing executive sponsorship and getting key stakeholders on board?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, first of all, even in the recent OCC and FRB interagency guidance, there is a lot of conversations about just making sure what are the board responsibility to hold management accountable. So it's not an individual problem to solve for the CISO. It's not an individual problem to solve for the CIO. It's really business accountability for ensuring that all of the vendors are managed appropriately. It's very interesting because there is also this connection of sort of shadow IT, citizen developer, and well, what are the vendors I'm protecting against? And it's really important to understand for the CISOs that they have to take enterprise view of the problem and tell that message to the executive team and management and provide clear, actionable metrics that can really measure that success. And then you're going to go deeper. You're going to try to decompose that messaging. But it has to be asking yourself a question: what does the board need to know about our vendor portfolio? Where do we really have risks? Are we appropriately leveraging that portfolio to get the commercial value, strategic value? And do we understand the risks? And is that going through appropriate issues management process where we truly, truly have appropriate risk treatment for once you identify, are you accepting the risk? What are you going to do about it? Who is accountable? So those basics that we actually see as part of overall enterprise risk management really apply on steroids for third-party risk.
I love the quote that you have in your book, which covers compliance fairly comprehensively, also in the context of preparation. But there's a quote that really stood out, and it echoes the sentiment that I have. And the quote says on page 127, compliance with a multitude of regulations is certainly a key objective of any cyber vendor risk program. That said, a compliance focused program will often be behind the curve, and instead, it's helpful to think about managing risk as the primary focus. So, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, first of all, right, I always leave it up to you to be so detail oriented and find a needle in a haystack and really look for those insights. And that's what you've done throughout your career, right? That's what the gist of Security Scorecard, that's how it was born. So thank you for quoting page number 127. You were exactly right. I think regulatory compliance is so important. Complexity of global regulations are really going to continue to evolve. We have, for third party risk, convergence of data privacy regulations, various regulations that are coming from all over the world. There are best practices in information security. There are global regulations in every jurisdiction. There is also regulation regarding just making sure that you have best practices. If you are doing business in New York, there is New York DFS. They have specific expectations as well. So every regulatory entity is putting their lens for their particular scope. And that is important, right? To make sure that they are continuing to supervise accordingly. So while that complexity is there, it's always going to be behind from the converging risk that's really required for thinking through TPRM the way it is today and even how it's going to evolve even more. So what we've seen just from my experience working across so many banks and helping them and other financial institutions, you really have to understand your regulations, that where those controls are that map to those regulations. And that to me just table stakes, because otherwise you'll just have to shut down, right? Because once regulators come in. But it's really prioritizing risk and knowing what's important and looking ahead. And of course, I always love to talk about AI and AI agents coming and what that will mean. But just even as we are entering economy of the future, staying on top of the risks will be even more critical to understand them from risk management perspective while fully considering compliance risk.
So, our chief security officer, Steve Cobb, every Christmas he plays a cyber Santa. He dresses up as a cyber Santa and he publishes a naughty list, cybersecurity naughty list. And there were two things that made his naughty list. The first thing is just questionnaires as they are that people use to assess cybersecurity vendors, and the second is vendors who default to opting into customer data and AI features without adequate notice to truly assess risk. So, in your book, there were a couple of really interesting tips also around assessments, audits, and diligence. So, I guess the first question I have is what can companies, both giving and receiving questionnaires, do to improve the questionnaire experience function within the vendor lifecycle? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, the questionnaire it's a really, really interesting concept, because the notion of sending questions to your vendors and asking them, hey, please tell me how you do something. Well, you got to remember that those vendors get thousands of those things from everybody, and just relying on quality of that information and also how specific is that questionnaire going to be to your specific products and services is really where there is a big sort of discrepancy. So it's this false sense of security that you get by really thinking, you know what? I have to add a new domain. Now I have to ask about AI. I have to ask about something else. Let me ask more questions. That's how I'm going to improve risk. More questions is not good, right? More questions sometimes results in that false sense of security. It's the better questions. And not even the questions, it's what are the control objectives? Like what are you trying to solve? And then do you even need to ask this question? Why can't you do continuous monitoring? Like the company that you founded, Alex, looking at the security profile from outside in, that's a great way of reducing the surface area for need to ask some of those questions. But the thing to keep in mind, there is self-attestations, which is when you're asking questions, you're getting a response. There's a lot of room for error because the way you ask the question may not be pertaining directly to your product or service. Whoever is answering the question in self-attestation may be too junior. Then your team that's interpreting the answer to the question may not really have the same interpretation. So just relying purely on questions is not great, but it's always a starting point for the industry. Then there is the validated questions. So when you do things like remote assessment, desktop assessments, please don't even answer questions. Just answer questions and give me evidence. Give me a copy of your policy. I want to talk to you about it. I want to make sure that I actually can see some flavor of you doing what you said you were doing. So that is the next level of due diligence. It gets very expensive for both the vendor and the company, and a lot of back and forth. It's marginally better, and it's an important part of the overall third-party risk management component. And finally, there is the on-site assessments or deep assessment that you do to physically go and look CISO in the eye and say, show me how you do the last test, show me your last vulnerability report, show me evidence that you've done something about it. Hey, how are you managing your suppliers? Show me the last test you've done with your critical vendors. And that gets very time consuming. And quite honestly, a lot of major vendors just say no. It's kind of expensive. So I think a combination of making sure it's fit for purpose. If you are relying on your third party risk program, just answering questions, asking questions, and adding more questions and more questions, you are spamming your vendors, you may get a false sense of security, and you probably are not future proof for where you need to be.
You talked about the snowball effect in a book and how it can become less frustrating for the vendors not getting what they need from fellow vendors. Like, what is the snowball event? Can you talk about this?
Yeah, so I found, so when I joined what's now S&P Global running an industry utility, I had a fascinating discovery. So, as being on the bank side and always asking questions and asking for due diligence from vendors, it's almost like, well, I'm a large bank. Please answer my questions because, of course, you have to. But then, being inside a very large, multi billion dollar fintech, I realized every vendor is actually every company is a vendor to somebody else. So while we were asking questions, we were getting questions at scale, and that volume of questions and due diligence requests was going through the roof. So actually, there is this notion of you do work yourself, and if you're looking for control environment transparency, one spectrum is, hey, I'm doing work myself, I'm going to outsource some of it, but once I outsource it, it's arm length, I don't want to know what you're doing. But regulators and just risk management expectations are, you got to see if you're outsourcing something, what is it that you're outsourcing? How do you know that your supplier, your partner, is doing things that are consistent with your own expectations for your own control environment? So there is more and more demand from the regulatory pressures, from risk management expectations, and the volume of those questions keep growing, growing, growing. So, and large companies have to do something about it. So now I'm like, okay, we're no longer answering questions. We're going to try to come up with just here are our standard responses. Google did a nice job. We actually worked with them back then, and we put together something for them where they can just point to and say, here is all of our information for security. Go look it up yourself. It's self-service. It works well for the customer, works well for the vendor. But if you just go on a trajectory that the answer for more transparency as this demand kind of increases is to answer more questions, deeper questions. I mean, it's not sustainable. It's just really, really not sustainable for the industry. So it snowballs. It snowballs. It snowballs for the customer, snowballs for the vendor. There is no such a thing as I'm a customer or I'm a vendor. Everyone is both.
What do you wish more companies knew about SOC reports? You talk in the book that SOC report could be a common trap of giving inexperienced customers a false sense of security. Why is that?
So the one big insight, Alex, that I found throughout my experience with third-party risk, SOC report was always looked at as a holy grail. Like, oh, of course they have a SOC report. Well, that's it. So if they have a SOC report, it's good. I don't have to look. There are multiple types of SOC reports. So I actually dedicated a whole chapter in the book. How do you think about it? How do you interpret it? Why is it good? Why is it bad? But things like, is SOC report actually covering your products and services that you are consuming? Is it covering the control environment that you care about? Or is this a generic set of control environments that does not specifically get tailored to what you need? There are two types of SOC reports. One is really done over a period of time. That's a better quality. That's type two. Type one is still good, but it's a bit more generic. There are a lot of nuances as well for sort of exceptions that companies call out. That's right, it's a SOC report, but I'm just letting you know you got to look at those things too, and you got to translate it what it means for your specific products and services. But what I'm advocating, because people come to me as they have startups and say, "Hey, I don't have money to do anything. I just like want to focus on growth." I actually do think getting a SOC report in early part of your journey forces you to start proactively thinking about your control environment and risk management, and it will give assurance to your customer to some degree, especially if it's in a regulatory space, if it's financial services, healthcare. So it's a good thing to kind of have. It's just not a holy grail. So somebody who is not as experienced just saying, "That's right, I got that SOC report, I'm good."
And
Yeah,
it's also a point in time, right? You might get a beautiful SOC report, or you might get a beautiful security pen test assessment, and then a week later, a sleep deprived IT administrator misconfigures the system and the vendor gets hacked.
exactly. So that continuous monitoring element is just so important. And that doesn't fully get considered in the SAC report as well. So I think it's a tool in the toolbox. I do advocate for having the tool, and that's, I think, is good. But again, this is where you got to put it in a broader context.
So, if you had to highlight some best practices and maybe share some anecdotes behind the scenes, how do you make sure internal audits don't compare quote from your book to a root canal? What would they be?
So it's very interesting. I have a lot of unique perspective working with internal audit departments. And I think the perception with practitioners, if somebody is running a risk management function or anything where they know internal audit is coming to audit them, is this adversarial relationship. And I just don't think that's a healthy way of thinking about it for for companies, for especially for somebody who is running third-party risk. So I decided to dedicate a book to a chapter, what are the best practices to work with internal audit. And the big thing I often hear, I'm doing something because internal audit wants me to. And this is where I'm like, guys, stop. You never should be doing anything because internal audit wants you to. It's a third line of defense. They're supposed to be independent, but you really got to look at it from their objective. They ultimately want you to be successful. They want you to they want you to pass. They don't want to write you up. So there is a big advantage in a partnership of engaging with internal audit proactively, making sure that you really engage them in your decision making, you keep them in a loop. They always will remain independent, and they always reserve the right to even say, like, "Hey, I know I kind of gave you this guidance, but that was my advisory capacity. Once I look closely, it's actually not fit for purpose." I think that's really the way to go. The other thing with internal audit to keep in mind, it's a strategic relationship. And often, what actually I found, a lot of really, really smart people who are in internal audit, then they get hired into first line of defense into very senior roles. So I personally hired people from that, throughout my career from internal audit. I've seen people who've done very well coming from internal audit into line one. It's an amazing career track. And quite honestly, some of them may become your boss in the future. So always be nice to your internal audit partners.
Let's prognosticate about the future of third-party risk management. Like, let's talk about what does a future hold for us. Everybody's talking about AI. How do you think the future of third-party risk is going to be influenced by LLMs to process questionnaires, potentially AI agents? Like, do we envision that maybe agents are going to talk to agents and assess third-party risk, and it's all going to be automated? Like, how do you think AI is going to influence the third-party risk management?
So you hit the mark with me, right, Alex? Because I know we spoke about it. I'm now in process of working on my next book about AI agent risk and how do we think about the future. And it's going to be a 2026 publication. It's been a lot of fun to research and think about. But third-party risk will change dramatically when you think about AI agents and the economy that's going to be supported by all of that. So there are a couple of things that I'm predicting. One, there is this big convergence risk. So right now, all the individual risk stripes, and we spoke about it earlier. We spoke about cyber risk, we talked about compliance risk, and the way it's being managed, it's really being managed more in silos. The new economy requires more of an integrated approach because a lot of those risk decisions are integrated. For example, if we think about what happened with FTX when it blew up, was the industry appropriately stress tested? How much of that was due to the siloed approaches? Was that financial risk? Was that operational risk? I don't know what it is. How do we think about suppliers in terms of big industry events like SolarWinds? What risk is that? Did you appropriately consider resiliency risk? Or was that cyber risk? Or was that technology risk? Very interesting questions, but holistic approach of thinking about it has always been a journey for third-party risk. I think that's going to get on steroids in terms of convergence. The second point is I'm predicting we're not going to be working with people, to your earlier point, exclusively. We already see a lot of companies are hiring AI agents or building AI agents and treating them as digital employees. That trend will continue. And today, hey, please meet your digital employee, and they actually have a supervisor that's human, that's going to get a lot more mixed. So I think that AI agents will get integrated much deeper in the future into enterprise control environments and will have very interesting workforce management constructs. And when we talk about, well, what's a party? What's a third party? Is party like a vendor that's giving me software infrastructure, or like is it like a DAO, distributed autonomous organization, that has a mix of people and agents? Once you get agents connected to a blockchain wallet, you start creating independent wealth. We've seen it already end of last year with Virtual's protocol being launched, and some of those agents were like worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You got agents that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ownership structure is unclear. What if one of those agents is providing you services? Are you going to send it questions? Are they going to answer a questionnaire? Well, no. It's a whole different construct. So just a different mindset when it comes to that. And then one last point that's really fascinating to me. So I've been doing a lot of work on data risk management, data governance. How much of these services in the future will be really codified as part of your data supply chain versus traditional services that we expect? So thinking about that will be really, really fascinating for third-party risk. So right now we're like, hey, what's your penetration test? Well, where did your data come from? So I'm buying services from you. You're giving me data. How do I know the data is not poisoned? How do I know bad actors did not really do something to that data that I'm now consuming?
I
Am I
think especially for agents, this is going to be very interesting because if you're training LLM on a big set of data, what I heard is that if you have a small piece of data which is poisoned, you cannot just untrain it. You have to retrain the whole thing from scratch. And you can introduce very interesting, very subtle biases. Like, for example, it works 99.9% of the time correctly, but then on a 0.1% of the cases, you use the poison data, which introduces a very significant bias into the equation. So, this interesting what you said, that there are different types of third-party attack vectors that now become possible.
I think what's really, really interesting, that's exactly right. We have not thought about data as an asset. We always think as data is just a thing that sort of flows through the the vendor services that we are consuming. It's no longer the case. So it changes the AI agent economy changes this whole construct. What is a party changes, and what is the third party changes, because your third party could be a data provider of a data provider of a data provider that train the data, introduce some biases, and now you're getting a poison data set that you're consuming. So very different mindset for managing this in the future.
So third-party risk is obviously more than cyber, right? Like let's say you're a third-party vendor and you run out of money. That's a risk. Or let's say you're a third-party vendor and the CEO goes to a Coldplay Coldplay concert, gets caught on camera, and all of a sudden, there's a reputational risk, right? So there's all kinds of risk besides cyber risk. So ESG risk, country risk, financial risk, money laundering type of risk. So how do you think all these different risk domains, especially as they fall within TPRM, are going to be converging? Are they converging? Are they separate? Like maybe what do you think about that?
Exactly, exactly, and that's really been the trend. So I've been watching the trend throughout my career, and it's just kind of accelerating. We spoke briefly about some examples earlier about FTX and SolarWinds and the combination of those risks and how it's converging. We spoke about AI agent economy and like, well, what does that mean? Like, I'm looking at those types of risks. Can I nicely isolate it and just say, this is exactly the type of risk? A couple of very interesting ones that are very blurry is cyber risk versus resiliency. What exactly is cyber versus resiliency? So, in examples where we have major outages due to cybersecurity strikes, I think the two kind of go hand in hand, and it's important to consider that. I think increasingly we're going to see the data risk being converging with everything. So the notion of some of those existing risk stripes being considered a risk stripes and more of a vertical view, starting to look more like a horizontal capability that goes across. And I think with time, and more of those verticals will turn into horizontals. And this is where things really, really will get interesting. But as a cybersecurity professional, we are trained traditionally to think cyber risk is my holistic program and how does third party risk play part of my cybersecurity program. Increasingly, it's more what is the enterprise view of third party risk and how does cyber support that across the board. So this has profound implications of even roles of CISOs and cybersecurity professionals. And I wonder, as I think about the future, how some of those roles will evolve with the new economy.
We're not going to talk about specific vendor names, right? But if we talk about categories, right? Like, what do you think are the categories of security solutions or risk solutions that you're like very bullish on, where you feel like a lot more innovation can happen, and where you potentially bearish?
Yeah, I think that security solutions are spinning up left and right, as you know. It's it's really funny, right? Because how many calls do we get for, hey, I have this new cool thing that I'm working on, and it can kind of control the risk. So I do think we're enterprise innovation, relationships that were built over a long time. I'm very bullish of enterprises and security solutions that really have the continuity, kind of like in your case, I know you founded SecurityScorecard. you've built it, you scale it, and building an ecosystem. So I think an ecosystem approach to building innovation will show sustainable success. I don't think that we can have so many different point solutions in the industry. It's just not scalable. If you look at the VC space, most of the startups fail. It's just not going to be there. And if you're selling to the enterprise space for an enterprise to onboard a new solution, do due diligence, take the risk of it not being there tomorrow, not getting enough attention, not being able to see the track record of having the trust is actually a big risk. It's a big risk, right? Because then there is the vendor switch. What about performance? So I think those partners who really focus on that continuity, sustainability, investing in relationships with enterprises, having this big track record, thinking always about the future, thinking about the space and what's outside of that window and what's ahead of me, and always being proactive, those are the ones who will be there 20, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, in a totally new economy with a new set of services that we didn't fully visualize yet, but they do, and they can kind of see one step ahead.
Alex, well, I wish we would spend a lot more time together, but we're coming to an end. So, are you ready to get into the rapid fire questions?
All right, let's do it.
So, what's your favorite book? It could be in any field.
And you feel I really, Daniel came in thinking fast and slow. It's like 500 pages. These guys won Nobel Prize. I read it like 3 times. I'm fascinated by how they hack the brain and all the biases and just what that means as we're thinking about the new AI agents and all the biases and hallucinations. I just find that research timeless and the guy is a genius. So that's my favorite one.
Who is a leader that you most admire?
Just growing up, I really admired Bill Gates. Now he's doing all this philanthropy work, so I think it's just really good to see him give back and apply sort of his wisdom towards greater good.
If you could have a dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be? What would you discuss? And what food would you order?
Ooh, three. Well, I would love to have dinner with you, and that's always a privilege.
I'm really flattered, but besides me.
Besides you, right? Um, how about Warren Buffett? I would love to have dinner with Warren Buffett.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. The first edition of Navigating Supply Chain Cyber Risk book is available for purchase. It's highly, highly recommended if you're looking for a guide on how to scale your TPRM program and just for great, great insights. It's called Navigating Supply Chain Cyber Risk by Alex Golbin. And stay tuned for Alex's next book. And in case you missed a part of this discussion, this webinar will be available on a Bright Talk channel. So have a great rest of the day. Alex, thank you.